Hi all. In this lecture we will be looking at the position of the Kingdom of France heading into the pivotal year of 1789. In particular, we will be looking at the political, cultural and economic status of the kingdom in an effort to better explain the remarkable revolution which was about to take place there. France in 1789 was ruled by King Louis XVI, who was its undisputed leader and was able to govern pretty much as he wished. This system of rule, the ancient regime, was in accordance with the principles of absolute monarchy practiced elsewhere in Europe, although few countries granted their kings the amount of power possessed by Louis. Louis's great-great-great-grandfather, the Sun King, Louis XIV, had ensured that the supremacy of the king and his court over the nobility prevented the development of a parliamentary system such as that in Great Britain. In France, the king was seen as the father of all people in the country and was blessed with supernatural powers such as the ability to cure disease with his touch. Both Louis XIV and his successor Louis XV had unusually long reigns, solidifying the power and mystique of the monarchy, which was given shape in the marvelous palace of Versailles outside of Paris. However, despite being the most powerful person in France, its father and the representative of its god on earth, Louis XVI had little interest in politics, preferring to hone his skills at hunting or tinker with creating clocks and watches. France was the most populous nation in Europe, and the population was rapidly growing ever larger, increasing from under 20 million to over 30 million in the course of the 18th century. France's large population made it the heart of European cultural and diplomatic circles. It is difficult to overemphasize how influential trends in France were over educated opinion in Europe at the time. Every man of letters, both in Europe and the North American colonies, followed the latest news in Paris eagerly, responding to the latest changes in fashion or philosophy that came out of the French capital. Every European diplomat used French as the language of negotiation and diplomacy, a trend which would continue well into the 19th century. Meanwhile, on the field of battle, the French military was the largest and one of the best drilled in all of Europe. In the American Revolution, the French Special Expedition had served with distinction, as had the French Navy at Yorktown. Despite the prestige France enjoyed, the kingdom was not as strong or as unified as it appeared from the outside. For a start, each of the regions of France, known as provinces, enjoyed widespread autonomy following traditions left over from the Middle Ages. Whilst the court at Versailles made policy and laws, their enforcement in regional France was the responsibility of so-called intendants, who had to adapt these policies in the face of local conditions. Local law in provincial France was a mess, a situation that can best be highlighted by examining tariffs. In 1789 it was more expensive to ship wine from central France to Bordeaux than it was to export that wine from Bordeaux to England. Moreover, the size and borders of the provinces was haphazard, relating to their feudal origins. Some provinces, such as Foix in the south, were small and poor. Others, such as Champagne or Lorraine, were large and relatively wealthy. French society was also disunited and was divided into small communities. These communities, such as a peasant's village or a craftsman's guild, all endowed a member with certain rights, whilst also demanding of them certain obligations. Membership of a village could, for example, come with the benefit of having a small parcel of communal land, but it would also require the farmer to work the lands of other villagers when necessary. The important thing to note is that privileges and rights were not granted to individuals, but only to the collective organizations they were part of. A particular craftsman had no rights, but his guild did. There were certainly few rights that came from being Frenchmen, whatever that concept meant, meaning that loyalty was not held to the nation, but to the local community and to the semi-mythical person of the king. We should note, however, that the poor travelled around France more than they did in Austria or Russia, and that serfdom was so rare as to be functionally non-existent. The Catholic Church was a very powerful and respected institution, to the extent that it was not subservient to either the monarchy, as in Russia, or to the state, as in the Protestant countries of Northern Europe. French Protestants were forbidden from practicing their religion until 1787, and Jews even after that. The Church kept detailed records of all births and deaths in the country, a privilege that it jealously guarded from the state. It also worked with the secret police to ensure the censorship and destruction of all salacious texts, an increasing problem as Enlightenment ideals began to spread. In most respects, the villages of France remained very traditional. Land was still cultivated in small plots, as opposed to the large collective holdings appearing in Britain, and oftentimes peasants even farmed land belonging to others in the villages, as they did in Russia. The growing population put pressure upon the small land-holding peasants, but it aided the richer peasants who were able to sell off small sections of their land for those desperate to buy. Landlords also got richer as a result of this process. Nonetheless, there were some improvements in the life of the peasants, as the end of widespread famines and the introduction of American crops such as corn and potatoes ensured that most at least had something to eat. Industrialization was slower than in neighboring Britain, but it was well underway by 1789. In particular, workshops on the Belgian and the Swiss borders were increasingly organized using the latest modern techniques. What French merchants lacked was a way to distribute either coal or manufactured goods quickly throughout the country as their British counterparts could do. Internal tariffs and poorly maintained roads prohibited the growth of a single national market and limited possible profits. French goods were, however, considered to be of a far higher quality than their British counterparts. In particular, French textiles, porcelain and furniture were some of the finest in the world and were in high demand, especially in the United States of America. France's greatest export was ideas, and Enlightenment thinkers throughout the country conceived and wrote of new ways to organize politics and society. The Enlightenment thinkers heavily criticized the absurdities of the ancient regime and called for the destruction of many of France's traditional institutions. Voltaire, the most famous of the Enlightenment authors, used his wit to attack the absurdities of absolutism and intolerance. His defense of the Protestant Jean Calas, who was tortured and killed in 1762 for the supposed murder of his son, was notable for the way in which Voltaire gathered public opinion against this injustice. Another Enlightenment author, Montesquieu, compared France's political structure to countries around the world and found it lacking in many regards. He particularly spoke against the undue influence of the Pope in French affairs, referring to him as an ancient idol worshipped from habit. Another thinker, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, called for a return to a more natural way of living, without the artifice found everywhere in 18th century France. Because men are born free, Rousseau argued, the only legitimate government is one in which all members are citizens with equal rights and have the ability to participate in making the laws under which they live. A common will could develop in like-minded communities which could guide policy making. Like Montesquieu, Rousseau was not a revolutionary. He expressed a deep pessimism about the chances of freeing humanity from the institutions that were in place. His ideas, however, were picked up by revolutionaries, particularly after 1789, when Rousseau was read as an advocate of Jacobin-style democracy. In particular, his vision of a common will would be corrupted beyond all reckoning by future political figures to justify a dictatorship. It should be emphasized that for the time being these ideas were only accessible for the elite, with two-thirds of the population of France in 1789 remaining illiterate. Just like Britain, France possessed a colonial empire in the Caribbean that it exploited for economic gains. Thousands of slaves were forced to harvest sugar and coffee for French profits in Guadeloupe, Martinique, and St. Domingue. Saint-Domingue, soon to become Haiti, was the richest colony in the entire world and was home to 400,000 slaves. Slavery made massive profits for not only the plantation owners, but also bankers and manufacturers back in France. The white population in Saint-Domingue, after all, was determined to follow the latest trends and tastes coming out of France, and had all the money in the world to afford the finest goods available. French foreign policy in the 18th century was divided between the desire to maintain France's dominance in Europe and its wish to expand its colonial ventures. The former would bring the country into conflict with either the Habsburgs or Prussia. The latter path would lead to war with Great Britain and sometimes Spain. These tensions had unfortunate results for France in the Seven Years' War, in which French armies suffered humiliating defeats both in Germany and in North America and India, due to being spread too thin and lacking a clear strategy. France did win a prestigious victory against Britain in the American Revolution, but this success brought the country few immediate gains and plunged the French treasury into massive amounts of debt. In particular, the cost of maintaining a navy that could match Britain's was extremely high, especially as the British won a series of naval confrontations in the Caribbean after Yorktown. The monarchy attempted to improve the French economy in a number of ways. It offered tax breaks for farmers willing to work new land, it built and repaired roads, and even subsidized the all-important slave trade. Internal barriers were knocked down one by one. Merchants and bankers who gained enough wealth and gave enough in donations were elevated to the ranks of the nobility. Desperate attempts were made to reform the tax laws and to tax the nobles, but these were highly resisted both by the nobility and poorer Frenchmen. As the crown slid further and further into debt, resentment against its tax collecting increased. The monarchy sold administrative titles to those able to afford them, but this created a bloat of needless bureaucratic positions which actually slowed down the running of the country and thus hindered the economy further. In 1776, King Louis dismissed his leading economics minister, Turgot, who had hoped to rationalize the French economy by cutting back government expenditure and banning the guilds. Turgot was attacked by both the church, shocked at his attempts to legalize Protestantism, and the peasants, who were hurting after a poor harvest and wanted protection on the price of their grain. France fell further and further into debt, and for a decade there were no real reforms, save an end to the process of arbitrary imprisonment in the Bastille. By the time in 1786 that the king was convinced to bring together an assembly of notables, which was an elite-level reform program, the prestige of and respect for the monarchy had sunk to an all-time low. Over the following 2 years, a series of harebrained schemes were unable to bring any solution to the debt crisis or to the increasing public anger in the country. Ordinary Frenchmen increasingly attacked the royal figures themselves. Louis XV was implicated in a series of high-profile adultery scandals, and Louis XVI was laughed at for being simple-minded and weak. None of the attacks on both men came close to the hatred displayed towards Louis's wife, Marie Antoinette. Marie was hated on account of being Austrian, France's traditional rival, and for her lavish spending and refined taste, which stuck out as insane in a time of national economic crisis. Marie Antoinette got through roughly 300 dresses a year and purchased incredible amounts of shoes, jewelry, accessories, hats, makeup products, and expensive perfumes, and was also a heavy gambler. The fact that she took 7 years to consummate her marriage with Louis led to wild accusations that she was cuckolding him, and a series of high-profile scandals broke out to this effect, although we should point out none contained concrete proof. To conclude for today, going into 1789, the monarchy's position seemed increasingly precarious. The biggest reason for this was not even the debt crisis, but more the idea of a monarch as divinely appointed father of the people of France was increasingly ridiculous in a time of rapid advancement of technology and ideas. Louis had been unable to agree to an effective policy with his nobles. In 1789 he would turn to the commoners for a solution to France's problems, with tragic results both for himself and for the ancient regime which he embodied.